Hi, I'm Dave with Taboo Customs. Today we're here to take a look at the install of one of our new kits, and that's the kit for the TJ frames, the steering box area for rust repair. This Jeep here is the 2000 TJ. Customer brought it in. Look at the body, doesn't have a ton of rust on it, doesn't have the typical rust in the fenders and the under the doors that you normally see. However, if you look at the frame is actually pretty bad. Customers already repaired the center section of the frame where the skid plate mounts, and they've also repaired the rear control arm area already. So one of the things that the customer noticed now is that he's noticed that a little crack has started to develop right in front of the bracket for the steering box. Now the crack really wasn't that big. It grew a little bit as we started taking things apart. You know, and it didn't look like a whole lot. However, what the customer didn't see is that when you look at the inside of the frame actually has a large hole, and then it's pretty much cracked almost the full length of the bracket. So there's really not much there. So that's why we're going in and we're going to do the install on this Jeep. To start the install, we removed the sway bar, the grill, the radiator, the condenser, everything from the front of the Jeep. We also loosened the steering box, but we left it connected to the steering shaft, and we left the hoses connected to it as well. Now the reason for this is that we need to get access to the inside of this frame quite a ways back. Now you possibly could install this kit without removing those items, but to be honest, it's a lot easier from a welding aspect to be able to remove those and to clean it completely and weld it correctly. With the kit, you'll get 5 10-gauge plates. You get an outside plate, an inside plate, and then 3 bottom plates, as well as a weld nut if you decide that you'd like to replace the nut on the bottom of the frame at the front. Alright, the plates for this kit are designed to go over the steering box bracket and over the frame. Now whenever we are welding these plates, we'll weld it to the bracket in 4 different places. We'll weld around each of the steering box bolt holes, as well as weld the slot here to the bracket, because with these brackets typically this area here is really still pretty solid. It's this area that will start to rust out, and we'll actually go in and we'll replate all of those areas. Now you could take, and if you wanted, cut this bracket off, replace it, and still use this kit. You would have to modify the kit quite a bit and basically cut across the top of the slot. If you do that, you're going to have to try to figure out how to widen the bracket to get around the extra plates. Now to start the install, the first thing we've wanted to do is actually remove all the material from inside of the frame, because as you can see, and we've already done it, there was a lot of material still inside the frame. And what's happened is this material, since it's in there, will allow the moisture to remain inside the frame and just continue to further cause more and more rust. So we've opened up a little bit larger hole than what it actually had, and we've actually blown out all the material from inside of the bracket and the inside of the frame. Okay, so now we've taken our grinder, we've gone in and we've ground down some of the welding that was originally on the frame, to make sure that these plates are all the way up against the frame. Now one thing I did fail to mention earlier is that when you're doing this grinding, make sure you're wearing the proper protective equipment, glasses, hearing protection, whatever you need to make sure that you're safe while you're doing these operations. Our next step then will be to take the plate, and then you can take a piece of chalk or a marker and start to mark out the perimeter of the plate, basically the areas that we're going to have to weld. Now, whenever we do install these plates, there's 2 holes up here that we will not be welding. Those are the holes for the little plastic cover that goes over the sway bar. Those are going to be pretty tight to the actual bolts, so we won't weld those, but we will weld this slot here. Unfortunately, the proximity of this slot to this hole, you probably won't really be able to get much weld up here, but you can try. If at least you can weld around that slot down there, that'd be good. We're obviously going to weld around each one of these bolt holes here, and then we're also going to weld around the tube across the top and then also across the back. Now we won't necessarily have to worry too much about the bottom sections because we're going to add plates to all the bottom sections. First thing I want to do is take off the heavy scale. Now I'll typically use a needle scaler, but a lot of people may not have these. What you can do is you can take a ball peen hammer or another hammer, go in there and basically try to knock off all that heavy rust and scale. Then after that, I'll use a combination of a wire wheel and a small die grinder to go in and clean up all of these areas. Now for these plates, I'll have to do both the outside plate and the inside plate first, and then we can move on to starting to tack the plates to the frame. Now if you want, and you have areas that are solid, like this area is actually pretty solid, we can go in and we can clean up some of those areas and weld those before we do put the bottom plates on. Okay, so we've ground down the sections of the frame where we're going to be welding the plates to. So now we're to the point where we can kind of look at the bottom plates. The front bottom plate has a couple of different options. The front bottom plate is the plate that is a little bit longer and is straight. If you look at the rear plate, it actually has a little bit of an angle to it because the frame actually starts to bend inward back there. That plate is for the bottom. The front plate is straight, has the hole that's it's about 3/4 of an inch from the edge of the plate. So what you can do is, your options are, you can either use this plate and just put it over the bottom and leave the bottom section in there. Now if the bolt just came out, that'll work. However, the thing you'll have to be careful of is, depending on what type of bumper you have on here, if it's tight to the bottom and top of the frame, you'll have to deal with that extra plate thickness being in there. However, what I would probably recommend for the most part is taking and actually cutting the bottom section of this frame out. You can cut along the weld at the front of the steering box bracket, along the side, and then basically cut along the edge of the frame here where the tube and the frame meet. So once you get that cut out, then we can start putting the plates on the outside, and we'll come back and we'll relook at this in a little bit. Okay, so now we're ready to start putting the outside plate on the frame. We have cut this bottom section out because I didn't want to replace the bottom section here at the front. So what we can do, you can take the plate, put it up there, and you'll need some either vice grips or some C-clamps or something to get started. And I would basically start at the top. You take your hammer, make sure that your alignment is good. I mean, you've got some holes here that are obviously kind of help locate things, but kind of center everything up. You also want to make sure that this front is pretty much flush. Once you have that in place, you can start tightening up your C-clamps, and then I usually use 3 to go along here, and then one at the back, because the back actually has to bend in a fair amount to meet the frame. So once you have that in place, we'll actually go through, we'll put about 4 or 5 tacks along the top edge of top seam here. Before you do that though, I want to make sure to mention that if you haven't done it already, if you're doing any welding on your Jeep, I'd recommend disconnecting the battery. If you don't disconnect the battery, there is the slight possibility that you could fry something, the ECM or something like that, and you don't really want to have to deal with that along with dealing with the rust. So anyway, now that we've got that done, we'll go ahead and put our welds along here. And I pretty much just, I said, evenly space out 3, 4, or 5 welds. Make sure the plate is all the way up against the frame. Okay, now that we've got the welds on the top holding, we can take our clamps off and we'll start moving down towards the bottom. Now, one thing that keeps this plate out is there's still that weld seam along here, and it actually keeps that plate pushed out. So what you might want to do before you do that, come up here, try to push in the area just above the plate, which might be better doing that from the top. Going ahead and putting a weld down on the inside of that slot. Now we'll move down to the bottom. We'll basically just work our way around to all the different areas, and anywhere there's a little bit of a gap, go ahead and try closing it off with one of your clamps. Until you get pretty much the whole outside tacked on. Once you get your outside to pretty much where it's tacked up there pretty good, you can basically go and repeat the same process on the inside. It'll self-locate on some of those holes. Try to line it up then as best you can. Start clamping it from the top. Start, tack weld the top, and then work your way down with those clamps. And then from there, we can move on to the bottom. Alright, so now that we've got the outside plate welded on, we've got our inside plate welded on as well, at least tacked in place so it's not going to go anywhere. Now we need to start working on the bottom. As I've shown, there's 3 pieces for the bottom. The first section we're going to install is the center section, and that center section is going to run from this corner here, this outside plate, all the way down and around and up to this radius here, just about in the center. So To start with that though, you'll notice that this plate has 5 different holes in it. One of these holes will actually line up with, there's a little drain hole in the bottom of the bracket. That hole should line up with, I think, this hole here. The other option for these holes, and I'm going to do it on two of the holes, is that if you have good metal down here, you can actually take and clean off those areas and then plug weld that hole to the steering box bracket whenever you get it bent around. So to start off, we're going to put the center bracket down here, pretty much line it up with the corner, and then get it centered in between the outside and the inside plate. Now you're going to want to make sure you don't have it at an angle, because if you have it at an angle like this, as it goes around, it's going to get farther and farther out when you bend it. So you want to make sure that you have it pretty well parallel to both the plates. Once you do have it in place, go ahead and tack it in. Before you start or go anywhere, double check your alignment. This actually mine's a little off. Okay, so now that we've got this welded, we put a couple of tacks up here, a couple of tacks down here. The reason we started putting these tacks down here is we're going to take a hammer and we're going to start bending this around to meet up this other area. So basically just keep working it around, keep tacking it as you go. Until you pretty much bring it all the way around to this corner. And then we'll push it up into the corner and go ahead and tack it. Okay, so now that we've got this center plate aligned and all tacked up, in the end you end up with a little piece that does stick out here. What you can do is you can just take a grinder and grind that off if you want, or you can leave it and weld it as is. It doesn't really matter. Now we can start to prep the front and the rear bottom frame pieces. And as I mentioned before, they're similar, but they are different. You can see this one has a bend. This is actually for the rear. This one that's straight and has the hole closer to the end is for the front here. So let's take a look at the rear real quick. And if you get under here, you notice that the frame actually is bent in here. So, and that's why this bend is in there. Well, what you want to do is you want to get in here and you want to mark out which side you want to bend, so that you don't bend the wrong side. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take this over to the vise in a second, and we're going to make a bend. So you'll have to do the same thing with the front piece, because the front piece will come down into this area. However, it doesn't really matter if you bend the right or left, excuse me, top or the bottom. Back here, obviously this bend is going to be much smaller. This bend is going to be quite a bit more. What you'll want to do is when we put these in the vise, you'll want to overbend them, because we'll come back here, we will weld these to these sections here first, and then we'll take a hammer and we'll force it up against the center plate. So now let's go to the vise. So, and we marked which side, we marked poorly which side we were going to bend. And there are notches in the plate to show you roughly where to make the bends. We lock those in the vise. Like I said, overbend it some. Now we have to do the same thing with the front plate. Okay, so now, in addition to bending the front plate, what you're going to have to keep in mind is that you have to weld the weld nut on top if you're going to be using the weld nut. And you got to make sure you weld it on the right side of the bend. So since we bent this down to go with the steering box bracket, we're going to want to make sure we put that nut on the top. Okay, so now that we have our pieces bent, we went ahead and I welded the nut to the top of the front piece. We'll go ahead and we'll start working to install these. Now before you get started, you will have to make sure you clean the area of the frame back here. This piece here butts up against the track bar mount, so make sure you clean that weld up pretty good, or else you're going to end up with a bad weld there. But there should be more than enough material there with the track bar mount located there to be able to weld. So similar to the center section, you'll want to line it up between the two plates as close as possible. And once you get it in place, start it tacked in. Get it tacked in, adjust the alignment if you need to. Okay, so welded it pretty good there, and I left this end welded, and the reason for that is we're actually going to close up, because you can see how the gap comes up here. We're going to close up some of that gap. Okay, then we'll do the same thing on the other side. And once we've got that on there, we can take and close that up as well. Now for the front section, obviously you want to make sure your nut is on the top. You want to make sure that the plate is pretty much flush with the front, so that should set the correct distance back for your nut. Then it is a little bit tricky. You got to kind of hold it, and you want to have it basically the top of the plate flush with the bottom of the outside plate. And when I did that, it actually twisted in, so I'll have to bring it up on the outside, or excuse me, on the inside, and tack it. So now that we have the rear bottom section of the kit installed, we're going to start working on the front bottom section. The main thing with this is to make sure that we get the nut and the plate installed in the correct location so your bumper will bolt back up. You know, one of the main dimensions is going to be the 4-inch dimension from the top to the bottom. Now, with this kit, this plate is slightly different, but in the kits that you'd be purchasing, this plate the top of the plate would go flush to the bottom of this outside plate. And then as long as you have this plate flush up against the frame, then the dimension here should be set as long as you have it against the plate. Now, one of the things is, depending on where you cut your frame on the inside, you might have a large gap if you go to hit that 4 inches. So like right now we're at 4 inches, we've got about an 1/8 inch gap there. So one of the things we didn't show earlier that is included in the kit is just a little piece of 3/8 inch bar stock to basically go in there for us to be able to make up that that gap in there so we don't have that huge gap and we can get it welded up. So we'll tack that in place, and then we'll come around and we'll go ahead and we'll weld the front of that to this inside bracket here. Now this bracket around this tube should be pretty solid. I know if you get into here, into the actual frame, it's going to be pretty thin, but this extra bracket here should be pretty good. Now again, just like the rear, we're going to want to do the same thing. Make sure we're up where we need to be. Weld both sides, and then okay, so now that we've got all of our plates installed, we can go through and do our final welding. Pretty much I'm going to go through and I'm going to weld anywhere that I can. And anywhere that there's a gap, I'm going to take my hammer and try to make sure I close it up. I mean, the main thing is to try to make sure we get good welds and as many welds as possible on there. Now, there's going to be some areas, you know, like the front here of the frame where this frame pretty much gets paper thin here in the center, that you're not going to be able to weld. So don't worry too much about that. Just try to get as much as possible done. Okay, so we've got everything welded up on our kit here. The inside and the outside and the bottom's all welded solid now. A couple of things to watch out for as you're doing these is if you leave the steering box in there, as we did have to tie it up here to try to get in here and make it a little bit easier to get in to weld some of these areas. Some of the areas to watch out for as you're cleaning, these holes here kind of hard to clean out, and as you're welding you can have a little bit of trouble with these holes, as well as the areas on the outside of the frame here, especially around this front cross member tube. These cross member tubes on the inside like to rust out, so they're hard. It can be hard to weld around. We did some extra cleaning there and it turned out not too bad. This area back here can also be a little bit tough because of this piece that's welded in here, and honestly probably in some future kits we'll probably make that a little bit larger, so you don't have to worry so much about this piece right here. As far as the bottom goes, when you're welding up this bottom, the biggest thing is just making sure that the gaps are closed. And you can, as you're welding, just kind of close those up with a hammer. If you don't, you have the opportunity to blow holes, and then you'll have to try to fill in the holes, and it can be pretty tough. The last thing we're kind of look at here, last couple things. One, these holes here, if you have any welds, and I've got a couple here that look like they're raised up above this surface here, we'll actually go in, flatten those back out. The bolts that go in those holes are flange bolts, so we want to make sure that they're flat against that surface. And then one thing we already actually did do was we went in and we did clean up the weld here a little bit to make sure that no weld protruded down below that surface, so that our bumper could fit on there pretty easily. So that's pretty much it for the install of our TJ steering box frame repair kit. Thanks for watching. As usual with any other video, if this helped you out, a like or a subscribe would be helpful, especially for small businesses. And if you'd like to purchase our kit, they are available on our website, taboocustoms.com.